Ramadan, Passover and the Easter holidays overlapping this coming weekend, tensions are running high. The United Nations Security Council is holding an emergency session to discuss the recent violence. A spokesman for the UN Secretary General said he was appalled and disturbed at the violence in the Al-Aqsa mosque.
Tell you that the Secretary General is shocked and appalled by the images he saw this morning of the violence and beating by Israeli security forces inside the Al-Qibli mosque in Jerusalem. At a time of the calendar which is holy to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, this should be a time for peace and not violence. Places of worship should only be used for peaceful religious observances. And you may have seen that we also had a statement from Tor Venislan, the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, which was issued earlier this morning. He said he too is appalled by the images of violence inside the Al-Qibli mosque and disturbed by the apparent beating of Palestinians by Israeli security forces and the large number of arrests. Mr. Venisland also strongly rejects the stockpiling and use of fireworks and rocks by Palestinians inside the mosque. He called on political, religious, and community leaders on all sides to reject incitement, inflammatory rhetoric, and provocative actions, and added that the UN remains in close contact with all concerned parties to de-escalate the situation.
Spokesman for the UN Secretary General there. We'll have more on that story in just a moment. But first, Saudi Arabia and Iran have agreed to resume flights between the two countries and facilitate visas for their citizens. It follows a meeting between Saudi and Iranian foreign ministers in Beijing for the first time in 7 years. It's part of a Chinese mediated deal to re-establish relations after years of tensions. Tehran and Riyadh are working to reactivate trade deals and reopen embassies. Well, for more on both these stories, let's bring in Arise Special Correspondent Karl Bostic, who joins me live now from our studios in London. Good to see you, Karl. Let's start with the rocket attacks on Israel. Just update us on what has taken place today.
Charles, yes. What we're seeing is very rare, but no surprise. It's no surprise because you have two important religious holidays, Ramadan and Passover, overlapping at the same time. Charles, it's very, very rare that they overlap. In fact, it happens maybe every 33 years or so, because those holidays are determined by the lunar calendar and the religious calendars. So people saw this kind of collision of religions coming. That's for sure. What the problem was is that, Charles, with these attacks, you also are looking at, inciting regional violence from Lebanon or from Gaza or even Syria, for example. In other words, Charles, what you have, one of the holiest holidays, if not the most important one in the Muslim calendar, you've got worshippers at the Al-Aqsa mosque, the third most important shrine in the Muslim calendar, and Israeli soldiers attacking it. But again, there's so many nuances to it, Charles, because this is overlapping with the Passover holiday, which only happens, as I mentioned, only like every 30 years or so. Because in that period of time, this is a contested shrine. Not only is it the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest shrine for Muslims around the world, Charles, for Jewish people at the same time, it's the Temple of the Mount. It's a sacred location where Jewish temples existed centuries and centuries ago, more than 1,000 years ago. And this is where they want to conduct a pilgrimage to pray. The problem, Charles, is two things: that many parishioners inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque wanted to, stay overnight inside the mosque, which is basically what's expected during Ramadan. It has a capacity, the mosque, of 5,000 people. 400 or so were arrested on Wednesday, most of them released, because the Israeli authorities, they anticipated Jewish members of Israel wanted to come to pay their respects as a pilgrimage. But not only that, but even to conduct animal sacrifices. For example, sacrificing a goat, which, Charles, has not been seen in a very, very long time, even going back to ancient times, which would be like, really, in the eyes of Muslims, sacrilege, threatening their own holy site. And that's why you've got these provocations from Gaza, from Lebanon. But the real interesting thing, the last thing I'll point out is this, Charles, is that everyone saw this is coming. Everyone's preparing for war, but no one wants a war.
Right, well, that's interesting that you laid it out for us as thoroughly as you have. I was going to ask you what triggered this, but I'm glad that you've answered that. So let me ask you this, Karl. The Israelis say they are checking on possible Iranian involvement in all of this. We also know that Hezbollah controls security in southern Lebanon, and its approval would be needed to fire rockets. What are your theories about that, briefly?
Well, Charles, it's not even a theory, it's a fact. The last war with Lebanon was in 2006. It was a war which actually left Israelis shell-shocked. At that time, Charles, Hezbollah had about 30,000 rockets, mostly Iranian-made. Now, fast forward, Charles, about 17 years later, they now have an arsenal of about 100 to 1,000 to 130,000 rockets. Most of them only have a range of 20 to 40 miles, Charles. But now they've got long-range rockets, not many with precision made, that could even reach Tel Aviv. Only a few hundred, so to speak. But there again, Hezbollah also went through kind of a shell shock during that 2006 war because they suffered heavy, heavy damages. Nearly about 200 neighborhoods in South Beirut which were attacked, buildings destroyed, for example. They didn't want that kind of repeat. They lost their credibility with the Lebanese population. So right now, Charles, what you have is that they've got these short-range missiles that are now lodged in hundreds of villages, at least 200, along the Israeli border, southern Lebanon, that can strike Israel, for 20, 25 miles. And then much deeper inside Lebanon, they now have long-range missiles that can strike Tel Aviv. That's the threat. But you know what, Charles? It's really mutual deterrence. They don't want a war, but they're preparing for a war.
Right. And very briefly, Karl, because I want to get to the other story. So far, no Israeli retaliation for this, but not for long, do you reckon?
Well, this goes back to what I was saying, Charles. Very simply, I talked about this overlap, all right? Ramadan ends around April 21st, depending on how you look at the lunar calendar. Passover ends a week from now. So this next week, Charles, you and I could be having the same kind of conversation. We have to see what unfolds the next few days, because this could be repeat things, but both sides are not only measuring their responses because they have to be seen to be doing so, but they're also telegraphing and communicating with each side because they do not want it to escalate.
Okay, let's move on to the other story that we wanted to discuss with you, Karl. China bringing a measure of rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Their foreign ministers have been meeting in Beijing. I expect that won't make Israel very happy.
Charles, not only Israel, but also the U.S., because when you look at those handshakes, pictures that you saw, it's a win-win-win situation for Iran, for Saudi Arabia, for China. It's a win-win-win because they have different interests, but they're all converging at the same time. This is a tension that's been really, going on for the past 7 years, since 2016, when the Saudi embassy was attacked in Tehran and vandalized, and which is when they broke off relations. What's happening now is this, Charles, very simply put. Iran wants to end the isolation it's faced because of sanctions, because of domestic uprising and unrest, and it needs some stability. Saudi Arabia, under Prince Mohammed bin Salah, MBS as he's also widely known, they want to reduce the threat of violence because Iran has a proxy in Yemen with the Houthis, and they had a destabilizing impact with drone waves attacks in 2019, which temporarily cut off half their oil supply back in 2019. They want to end that. And then China China wants to see itself as a global player when it comes to being a broker of peace. The U.S. is compromised because of its role with Iran, the sanctions, the nuclear deal and such. It's a lot of moving parts. It's not just Israel. That's why Israel is nervous. That's why the U.S. Is anxious about all of this. But for now, temporarily, it's a win-win-win for those three. And very, very simply, Charles put, what this means is this. It means that they're saying we will now not only reopen the embassies, we'll reopen the consulates. We want to start with visits, commercial visits between both countries. We want to, restore tourism, and we'll even extend visas. But Charles, there's no timetable yet. But this will happen. But one indication is this. You now have on the official website of the Saudi airline, the national airline, destinations listed in Iran. No scheduled departures yet from Saudi Arabia to Iran, but now those destinations are listed.
Karl, thanks very much indeed. Karl Bostic, our special correspondent, talking to me there from London.